our job today is really to try to explain, as Josette said, what economic, social, cultural rights really are. It is something that we exercise every day, but never really, perhaps not always think about as rights. And as you know, the Human Rights Forum will entail a number of different seminars and discussions on economic, social, and cultural rights. And we would like to start from the beginning and trying to explain some of the terms and just the material rights and some of the terms that are connected to the struggle for economic, social, and cultural rights. So I will just be facilitating the discussions and perhaps ask a few questions to the panel when necessary, and we'll also take comments or questions from the audience, but leave that for the last 10 minutes of our 60 minutes together, which is quite short, in order to talk about such a sort of vast topic in a sense. So actually, we have divided it, our panel today, to first talk about a little bit about the economic, social, cultural rights, what they are and what they entail, the material rights, and also a little bit about the international system. We have focused on the international system for economic, social, cultural rights, as we don't have very much time. And then we will talk a little bit about some of the emerging rights. What are the challenges for economic, social, and cultural rights today, internationally and nationally. But I'll leave the floor to Maria to open and give us a presentation of what economic, social, and cultural rights really are.
All right, thank you. How nice to be here. Yes, I understand that. I'm sorry, it's a little bit, I can't see you. The lights are directly in my eyes, so I'm sort of looking into a sea of anonymity. So please, if you're really bored, just like make strong expressions to try and cut through the gloom. As you heard, I teach human rights, and our topic today is these rights that you associate with basic human needs: food, health, housing, decent working conditions, education, clean drinking water, adequate sanitation. And what I'm here to talk to you about is what it means when we talk about them as human rights. And to start off, you know, this very phrase human rights gets used in such different ways. And I think for most people in the world, when they use the phrase human rights, what they mean is a intuition, a sense, an emotion about things that humans should not have to endure, or things that humans should enjoy as being human. So we think human rights, if we think that health is a human right, we think to ourselves, it's unacceptable that I or any other human being should die from a disease that we know how to prevent. It's unacceptable that I or any other human being should die in childbirth when we can prevent that, and so on. It's unacceptable that people are without food. It's unacceptable that people are without education. And I think for most people in the world, when they talk about human rights, that's what they mean, is this personal moral sense of what the world should be like for human beings. Then there's this whole other meaning of human rights, which is what we might call the technical one. And it's the one that's based in international law. And it's the one where the countries of the world get together. Most of our human rights standards started at the end of the Second World War. So starting in the 1940s and on, get together and actually write it down as legal obligations, what governments are supposed to do with regard to these things that every human being should either have access to or not have to endure, and so on. And I think that today's panel is really focusing on the second one, on this technical one, on what's out there in all these international law and standards. And the reason for that is that these different uses of the term lend different tools for use to make people's lives better. The first one, you don't really need a bunch of people sitting around a room to tell you about. But the second one, all this technical stuff, how do we get from everyone has a right to the highest attainable standard of health to A, B, C, D, and E that governments are supposed to be doing? That you sort of need a little bit of an entree to. You need someone helping you into. And I understand that that's what our goal is today. Is that
Yes.
is that fair? All right. So so let me start with these the sort of technical side of economic social rights, which is really just 2 minutes of history. At the end of the Second World War, the UN gets started. They know they want there to be human rights. And they actually have to figure out what these governments that have created this new international organization are going to call human rights, right? They could say anything was a human right. It's up to them. They're the ones defining. They're the ones creating the laws, the rules. What are we saying is the right of every human being? And they actually had a lot of debate among themselves over what the core human rights should be. So they had a lot of debate among themselves about what these core human rights should be. And in the end, they included what we broadly categorize into 2 categories. Civil and political rights, which is what many people think of first, freedom from torture, right to political participation, freedom of expression, that kind of thing. And what we're talking about today, economic social rights. And they started putting these into legal documents. They put them into something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that I suspect everyone who hasn't heard of before will be hearing a lot of during these few days. And they put them into one of the core human rights treaties called, there are 2 core international human rights treaties that with this declaration make up the Bill of Rights. And one of them is called the International Covenant, fancy way of saying treaty, on economic, social, and cultural rights. They then kept putting economic social rights into other treaties. So if you've heard of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we get economic social rights there. And as this whole field of international law develops, where governments take on legal obligations to protect human rights, primarily for those under their own jurisdictions, but also outside, we see economic social rights, right to food, right to health, right to water, and so on, continue to appear in new human rights treaties. So if you're working on disability issues, they're there in a treaty on disability and so on. They also, again, going back to the start of this, they created mechanisms within the UN system. And that's what Anna meant, I think, when she said we were focusing on the international level. She meant as opposed to the regional level, because we also have regional human rights systems. But within the UN system, the global system, they even created little, or big in some cases, oversight bodies, committees of people who are in some cases representatives of governments, who do some looking to see what these rights actually mean and what governments are supposed to do. Okay, so and you'll hear more about that, I think, in the next panelist. So all of that is just to locate us now into what are these rights and how do we go from I have a right to food, which to many people in the world sort of sounds like saying I have a right to rainbows and unicorns, right? It just sounds so completely disconnected from reality. How do we go from that to something that's real, something that tells us I'm supposed to experience this, governments are supposed to accomplish that? And there are a few ways that over the past 40-odd years, I guess 50-odd years now, the international human rights system has developed to take these rights and make them real. One stems from a core issue that we tend to think of when we think of economic social rights versus civil and political rights, which is the notion that somehow or other civil and political rights are easy and cheap, that we accomplish them by sitting on our hands and not doing bad things. So if you have a right not to be tortured, my duty, and I'm the duty holder, well, what's my duty? My duty is to not torture you. I accomplish it by doing absolutely nothing, right? But there's a sense that if you have a right to not education, you have a right to housing, that implies that somehow or other I have to build you housing and hand you the key, and you just sort of sit on your hands while I give you free stuff. And that was really part of the issue around economic social rights, was the sense that civil and political rights were things governments could achieve quickly, easily, for free, and without a lot of policy debate. I think that that's not really true. I think anyone who's ever tried to run a justice system will tell you that having a court system is incredibly expensive, complicated, demanding. Right to vote requires booths and so on, requires ballots. So that part is easy to sort of say, look, civil and political rights aren't as easy as they sound. But the question was, are economic social rights really as hard as they sound? Does a right to housing mean a right to be given free housing? And of course, most people don't, that's not the way societies work, that government just provides everything for free. And also governments don't have resources, so does that mean you don't have any resources, you have no duties at all? Does that mean if you're a rich country, you have complete duties, and if you're a poor country, you have no duties? And in trying to deal with this sort of saying, look, even if you don't have a lot of resources, and even if, yes, food, health, housing, and so on requires lots of policy debates, what do we prioritize? What do we as a society think is more important right now? Education or health or housing? There are things human rights can add that actually sort of set boundaries the way civil and political rights do. And the international system has come up with a sense of 3 different kinds of duties of governments when it relates to these core rights we've been talking about. And one is what we call a duty to respect, just a word that was sort of brought into the mix. And it says, look, when we're looking at any issue dealing with food or health or housing or education, etc., government at least has a duty to do no harm. They have a duty to sit on their hands. They have a duty not to prevent people from accessing health care. They have a duty not to take actions that make people sick. They have a duty not to poison the food. They have a duty not to do things that make it difficult for the population or some parts of the population to experience a safe working place and so on. So you can imagine a very simple example would be oil is discovered. The government brings in the national oil company, starts digging up oil. People were living around there. They were doing fine, no problems. Now with the oil extraction, the water gets poisoned. People start getting sick. That would be a violation of the respect duty. If the government hadn't done anything, people would be fine. The protect duty, which is the next one, is a way of saying that governments also have a duty to prevent a third party, someone who's neither the people nor the government, so third, from causing these kinds of harms. So if that oil factory is a private company, a private oil company, the government has a duty to regulate and to enforce environmental regulations so that people don't get sick. And then comes the fulfilled duty. And the fulfilled duty, as this has been thought out, is a duty on governments to make sure, when it comes to these core rights, that systems are in place that everyone can enjoy the right through. So they don't have to give free housing, but they certainly have to ensure that there's enough housing in the country. And they have to ensure that the housing is accessible, including affordable, and they have to ensure that the housing is of good quality. And those 3 phrases I just made, that there's enough, that it's accessible, and that it's of good quality, are actually also more technical terms that we use in economic social rights, talking about the duties of governments. So if you're faced with a situation where people don't have access to health care or don't have access to education, you might be saying, is it because there's not enough in the country? And that would be this notion of availability. You might be saying, is it a question of accessibility? Is it not affordable? Or is there discrimination? Or is it too geographically spread out? Because if I'm having a baby here and the only hospital where I can get an attended birth is here, and that's a 2-day journey, then it's great we have a hospital, but it doesn't do me any good. And the last element of accessibility is what you might call physical accessibility, what we often call accessibility in the Western world, I think, which has to do with disability access. Because again, if I get to the hospital and I can't get in because it's not accessible to my wheelchair or whatever else I need, it doesn't do me any good. So this notion that economic social rights aren't just some sort of vague thing that are messy and complicated and expensive and governments can't afford to do them anyway, gets transformed into looking at any given situation and saying, is the problem accessibility, is the problem availability, accessibility, or quality? I get to the hospital, but there's no medicine there, it doesn't do me any good. And whichever one of those is the problem that the government is actually causing the harm, that some third party is causing the harm, but no one's fixing it, or that the systems aren't in place and the government simply is just letting it happen. Do I have a few more minutes? All right, excellent. Because I want to talk to you, if I may, I want to perhaps, no, I'm going to talk to you about one more technical concept. Then I'd like to draw back the lens and talk to you a little bit about what all this technical stuff does for you as advocates for human well-being, whether yourself, your own community, or someone else. But first, let me offer you a few more technical terms. And in my professor mode, if I had a blackboard right now, I'd be writing on it. So please picture me writing the words cross-cutting human rights principles. Human rights principles that cut across all kinds of different human rights. And this is a relatively recent development in the UN system. There's still even debate over what exactly vocabulary we use. But they really refer to how we implement policy. So if the question is, I have a right to health, that includes a right to access to health services, and I don't have a hospital I can get to because there aren't enough, or because it's too far away, or because I can't get in when I get there, or because someone turns me away because of the color of my skin or the language I speak. Did I mention non-discrimination as part of accessibility? I should have. Sorry. Core element. What about how the hospital is run? What about how decisions are made? What about what I do if the hospital isn't implementing my human rights well? And this is the cross-cutting human rights principles, the things that govern how everything is done. And there are a few. As I said, the vocabulary is still forming. I'm going to give you my version of the vocabulary. You'll read others in some human rights documents. The first one, huge, bright light bulbs all around it, the most important is non-discrimination. So if I have a great health system, but it discriminates, not human rights. And if I'm working on housing policy and I'm working on improving housing for people in the worst situations in the country, but how I'm doing it is discriminatory or is leaving out some part of that population, is not really paying attention to the fact that some people might not be part of this large group. So with discrimination, we sort of add this who might be left out. It's not human rights to housing policy, regardless of how many people it helps. So non-discrimination and attention to who might be left out, first and most major cross-cutting human rights principle. Then we get participation. And participation in international human rights speak refers to the ability to have a voice in decisions that affect you. Doesn't necessarily mean you're the final voice, but at least you have a voice. And in order to have a voice, we come to the next one, which is sometimes referred to as transparency, sometimes referred to as access to information. I tend to use access to information. It refers stuff we need to know to have a voice. And so that might include anything from budgets. It's really hard to analyze a country's health policy if you don't know how they're spending their money, or at least how they're allocating their money, which is what budgets tell you. Sometimes they allocate it in the budget and then they spend it differently, so it's important to distinguish. So we might need access to budgets. We might need access to information about who makes what decisions and how those decisions are made so we can attend the meetings. Some of the rights actually include access to information as part of the substantive right, not this how things are done, but the actual part of the right to health itself. For instance, access to information about health, including sexual and reproductive health, for instance. So access to information, I'm just going to walk you through them again. Non-discrimination, participation, access to information. And the last one, you'll often hear the word accountability used. I'll be interested to hear your takes. I hate the word accountability because I don't hear anything when I hear the word accountability. That doesn't translate into any concrete action to me whatsoever. So when I teach this stuff, I tend to think more in terms of this phrase, a means of complaint and remedy, which is still fancy sounding, but I can make it concrete. And a means of complaint and remedy, it's quite easy. I think my phone bill is normally something like 400 kroner a month. I don't know. I still don't quite think in kroner. I'm not from Sweden. And let's say I get a bill tomorrow for 40,000 kroner. That's just clearly wrong. No matter how many calls to America I made, I did not rack up 40,000 kroner in bills in 1 month. And so a means of complaint means I expect there to be a way to contact the phone company and tell them you messed up. There's a mistake on my bill. And that's what we mean by a means of complaint. Some way to contact whoever is doing this action and inform them that they're doing the wrong thing, whether under human rights law or even just under their own rules, like with the phone company example.
I need to stop you there, sorry.
Let me finish this concept. And remedy. So the means of complaint is I can contact them. Remedy is that they fix it. And these cross-cutting human rights principles run through all of these rights. I have one more set of things I was going to talk to you about, but maybe you'll give me a chance in the question and answers?
If we have the time, yes, please.
All right.
Sorry. As I mentioned before, we could actually talk about this for much longer than 60 or 55 minutes that we have. I just wanted to ask you a question because, and I think you did talk about it, but just to make it clear, and because there is a discussion about this, not least in Sweden today, would you say that everyone has the right to economic, social, and cultural rights? Can you draw a line, as some try to do, between citizens and non-citizens? Is that at all possible for a state to do?
So this is where we're getting now into the technical weeds. So I'm going to answer the question under international human rights law, which is different from anyone's, generic sense of how human rights should be. The treaty, the core treaty, which is only binding on states that have ratified it, guarantees the rights to everyone under your jurisdiction, and also has some discussion of duties of international cooperation towards people not in your jurisdiction, which would mean, for instance, we might use it to talk about how a wealthy country does its foreign aid, or even how a not-so-wealthy country does its trade agreements if that trade might end up with an even poorer country being poorer yet. The ICSCR talks a little bit about developing countries and some decisions about people who are not citizens, and this is heavily discussed in international human rights law in specific fields. So, for instance, if you're interested in access to health care for either non-citizens or undocumented residents, which is often where the tension lies most, is not non-citizens who are legally present, but often people without documentation. If you're interested in that in terms of the right to health, you will actually find many articles talking about the nuances of this. But it's important to mention that the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been ratified by every country in the world except one or two. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child guarantees the rights to every child under the jurisdiction. So it's much less ambiguous. So if you're dealing with child rights, you don't have to wonder whether or not the country's ratified the treaty, except for one or possibly two. I can't remember if the second one finally did it. Yes, it's ratified the treaty, so it's bound by it. And yes, it refers to every child.
Mm-hmm. And also because there is a sort of a feature of the covenant, the ESC covenant, that is not really found in the civil and political covenant, and that is about progressive development,
Yes.
exactly, etc. Can you just say a few words about that, and why is that feature there, and what does it really mean?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there was this sense that civil and political rights were easy and cheap, and economic social rights were complicated, policy-driven, and expensive. And that actually translated into the language that went into the treaties that set out the duties of the governments. And for civil and political rights, they basically agreed just to implement the rights. And for economic social rights, they agreed to take steps progressively to the maximum of their available resources to implement the rights. And that was interpreted for a very long time as meaning no duties at all. And almost everything that I've talked to you about today were attempts to take the implied lack of duties from that phrasing and step beyond them to something that made it clear what governments were supposed to do. So the respect, protect, fulfill trilogy that I gave you, the availability, accessibility, quality trilogy that I gave you, the cross-cutting human rights principles, all of those are in response to this notion that governments are limited to progressively realizing the right in accordance with their maximum available resources. It's worth just adding one tiny little thing to that, which is one of the very first things this UN Committee on Economic Social Rights did when it came into being, was to also add that there actually is a duty to take steps. So a government that sits on its hands with regard to health, education, or work will be assumed to be violating the treaty. So a failure of action would be considered to be a violation of the treaty. And you've actually seen that play out in some domestic courts that include economic social rights in their domestic constitutions. Yeah, we can leave it at that. But
yeah, thank you. You mentioned also the committee, and you will talk a little bit about the committee. But just to introduce your presentation, what you're saying, Maria, is also from some states also questioned, because it's really no court in a sense that, well, you can find courts that actually deal with economic, social, cultural rights, but mainly through perhaps civil and political rights, such as equality before the law and things like that. And that's also perhaps a reason why economic, social, cultural rights are contested. But there has been a lot of work being done by scholars and by the committee, the UN committee. And I will give the floor to you to talk a little bit more about the emerging rights and how the committee has been strengthening the system in a sense.
Yes. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Maria, for this really good basic knowledge about human rights and how the system works. Yes, I will maybe talk a bit more practical on how a human rights organization can work for a progressive realization of these rights. Fian, as we said in the presentation, we've been working for the right to adequate food for more than 30 years. And one of the things that I did a presentation. I don't know if that's possible to.
I didn't get.
I'm sorry. Anyway, the basis of all our work is that we work with different cases of breaches of the right to adequate food, or violations of the right to food, whatever you choose to use. And we use these cases to develop strategies to hold states accountable and for the victims to access remedy for the violations that they have have lived. So and then we use also all this experience from the different cases that we work on to push for within the system for a progressive interpretation of what the rights really mean. And one of the things that we saw very early was the justiciability, as you talked about.
No, actually, that is a
You didn't
very
mention it?
fancy word that we
Yeah.
have not yet used.
No.
When
But it's-
economic social rights first really started getting to the core, people were walking around trying to pronounce this word.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of us in New York,
Justiciability.
So you might have to define
Yes,
that.
exactly.
Yeah, it's the possibility or to actually get a court decision on a violation, I would say. The possibility to a court decision. That's not my. Anyway, we continue. We pushed. We were part of a coalition. I will just move this chair just to get some more space. We were part of a coalition that worked very hard for an optional protocol to the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. As Maria said, this thought of having the economic, social and cultural rights, that they were really hard to fulfill, and to that made they excluded this opportunity when they created these two covenants, because in civil and political rights they had this optional protocol already in the covenant from the beginning. So we started to push for this optional protocol.
Can I just ask you to clarify, because optional protocol
Yes,
is not really...
I'm getting there.
Okay, thank you.
It's yes. We started to push for this, and it's the opportunity for individuals and groups to pursue a legal complaint to the committee for the covenant. So in this case, it would be the Committee for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It's not a court decision. The committee will give recommendations. They will not draw a sentence, or they won't. But they are very good recommendations on how the state should do to actually fulfill, protect, respect, and fulfill this right. So, and this was really only possible after the Cold War. So it all started in '93 when at the World Conference for Human Rights they reaffirmed that all these rights, civil, political, economical, social, and cultural rights, that they were universal. So that's what we've been. That's one thing that we've been pushing very hard for. So in 2008, it got adopted, and even before, you had optional protocols to a lot of other covenants that include economic, social, and cultural rights, like the covenant on elimination of discrimination of women, and the child's rights, and so on. And in May 2013, it entered into force, which means that it can now be used. So last year, the Committee for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, they treated the first complaint that they received. And it had to do with the right to housing in Spain, that during the crisis, a lot of people lost their homes because they couldn't pay their mortgages. And the committee, they really gave recommendations in line with the complaint that was made to them, saying that the Spanish state didn't do enough to prevent this people from losing their homes, and that they also needed to develop legislative measures to prevent a repetition of this. So you can really see how this justiciability of economic, social, and cultural rights is now coming into force and really strengthening what the obligations for states are that have signed this covenant. So Sweden, Sweden has not signed this protocol yet. So we're questioning that hardly. We will have a seminar about it later today, together with the Foundation for Human Rights and Amnesty. And I also need to say that this opportunity to complain to the committee is something that you can do every time that the committee has their meeting, because normally a state, when they sign a covenant, they get reviewed by the committee every 5th year, or it depends on which covenant. So this year the Swedish state was reviewed by the committee, and they criticized it heavily that Sweden has not yet signed this covenant, because then that means that they, what she said they said in the question, this just that Sweden had not yet ratified the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It could be argued that greater attention was afforded to the justiciability of civil and political rights than to economic, social and cultural rights. Another thing about this justiciability is the third part that Maria also talked about, when there's in a lot of the cases that we work on, we see that there's another country also involved in the breaches. Like, for example, Swedish pension funds that invest in companies that displace people, like this oil company or something. So that means that we saw that there's a lack in international human rights law, or the interpretation of it. So that's when we started to talk about extraterritorial obligations. Now I say we, like Fian, are the only ones. We're not the only ones. It's a big, but we heavily contributed to this progress on what we call extraterritorial obligation, and it's clearly it's a misconception about human rights that it's supposed to be, that it has to do with the territorial relationship between individuals, the rights holder, and the state, the duty holder. And this means that that third part, like other countries, do not take responsibility to legislate, for example, TNC's actions abroad and things like that. But this is being increasingly, pardon? Oh, sorry, transnational corporations. Sorry. But this is being is gaining ground, the concept of extraterritorial obligations. And one of the reasons for that is we were part of arranging a seminar or a conference in Maastricht in 2011. And there were more than 40 international law experts from different regions, special rapporteurs also from regional systems that assisted that conference. And the outcome of that conference was the Maastricht principles. And they clarify the extraterritorial obligations of states, and they do not, in any ways, they do not invent new principles or new things. The principles that came out was all based on the international law that already existed. It was just summed it up in a very easy way to understand the whole concept. So now this is really gaining ground, as I said, and it's increasingly recognized. And you can see how many recommendations from these committees that do the review of the states that sign the covenants, not only in the Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but also other rights, how they push for these obligations, extraterritorial obligations, and they give concrete recommendations around it. And there's an increased jurisprudence, as you said, I'm using very hard words now, like
the
corpus
development
law.
of the concepts.
Yeah. It's really increasing, and you can also see in general comments. We didn't go into that neither. It was sometimes just to clarify what a right really mean and how it should be interpreted, especially the availability.
All these technical
all
terms.
those technical, they are often expressed in these kind of general comments to clarify the state's obligations when it comes. And so this is really coming through in these general comments as well. And right now, the Committee for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, they are working on a general comment on business and human rights, where this, of course, extraterritorial obligation is the basis of that, and they refer a lot to the Maastricht principles.
Can I just ask you, if you were to describe the comments or the sort of recommendations that the committee had when it comes to Sweden, can you just clarify a little bit what that really means? Because it was about the how pension funds invest. So what does it really mean? Can you try to explain that a little bit more?
What it really means it's that they clarify what the responsibilities of the obligations that Sweden has when it comes to the Swedish pension funds. That they can't just say that we can't regulate them because they are not a part of our. They are separated from the government or the
governments
the
are separated from. The companies are.
It's very complicated because they are state agencies, so they can't really say that. But anyway, and then they also do it. They clarify very how it. The state's obligation, especially when it comes to all those things that Maria said, how to protect. How to respect, protect, and fulfill. So they actually gave recommendations of very and also remedy for the victims.
So if Sweden, through their pension funds, invest in companies that violate human rights, but in another country, any country in the world, Sweden would be sort of responsible in a sense.
Yes, what they said is that Sweden need to implement a complaint mechanism for the victims, so that they would have the possibility to find justiciability in Sweden for the violations.
Yeah. How is this perceived by how is the reaction? Do you know anything about that from the government to this? Because it's a very important development of the economic, social, cultural, and also the responsibilities of the state. So how is that? Could be very huge in a sense. So how was the response?
Actually, we haven't received that much response yet. We are still we got this recommendation. Just really short. We wrote a parallel report, a report to the committee. When Sweden was being reviewed now. So we wrote a report on how the Swedish pension funds are contributing to breaches of the economic, social and cultural rights in different countries. And the committee then asked Sweden questions about it. Is this true? What do you do to prevent it? And so on and so forth. And then finally they came with very concrete recommendations to Sweden. So it's a long process. And we just got these comments in July. So yes, we've tried to contact especially the ministers responsible for the pension funds. And but we haven't yet had meetings around it.
But we know that the committee has given that kind of recommendations to a number of European or Western or Northern countries.
And it's the third time that Sweden gets the same recommendations. They got it from the Covenant on Committee on the Child Rights of the Children, and also said of the women, elimination of all discrimination.
Interesting development. Maria, you wanted to comment also.
Oh, just because I think we're about to close out.
We have 3 minutes.
Is that right?
And I haven't seen any hands, so I'm not sure that there are any questions.
I just want to get 2 concepts on the table that I think really builds nicely on what you've been saying, but concepts that I really think it helps about. If there are folks in the room who are working on economic social issues and wondering how human rights can help, or alternatively, folks who are working on human rights issues and wondering how to use them to help, you know, two really different approaches. I just want to put on the table a couple of things that human rights gives us. And one, I just want to make sure we had it in our discussion, is the notion of universality, which is what you were getting at with your question. But I just want to put it on the table that when we're using this technical notion of human rights, we really do mean every human being. That's what universality means. And not all systems for approaching social policy has that concept of universality. And we've also got legitimacy. The governments have ratified this stuff. The governments have agreed to it. So it's not just me, crazy person, saying, I think everyone ought to not be hungry, crazy me. There's actually stuff we can read where the governments have said, yes, we agree that we're supposed to do stuff. And we also get all this conceptual content. We get, what does it mean when there's a housing crisis? Well, okay, it means these kinds of duties. We get, yes, we can approach this through this notion of respect, protect, or whatever. These general comments that Rebecka mentioned, you can read pages on what the right to water is, and now you can read books on what the right to water is, and we have manuals for implementing the right to water. So there's more, there's internationalization, access to these fora, but really universality. If I can leave mine with this word of every human being, I'll be happy.
Thank
Can
you.
I just say, I just want to add something more that is coming also around just the interpretation and how what does it really mean, the right to adequate food, and that's really interesting to see how the discussion now goes towards making the right to natural resources, land and seeds and water, a human right, because it's so essential for the fulfillment of the right to adequate food. So, and if you're interested in this issue, we will have a seminar at this stage at 1 o'clock, talking just about peasants' rights and how it should be, the development on economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to natural resources.
Thank you. I think there is no questions. So we need to wrap this up. And you mentioned it, you did it very well when it comes to talk about the universality. Do you want a final word on because what I wanted to, otherwise what I want to ask is, do you think that Sweden will ratify the optional protocol, giving a complete mechanism to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in the near future?
That's a very complicated question. It's not that easy. Yes, I certainly do think so. This government that we have today, when they were in opposition, they were quite clear that they...
But not when they were in power before that.
No. So we still have a lot of hope that they will do it. They say, the answer to the committee, the critique, they said that they just need more time to examine. They don't want to sign anything that they can't fulfill.